Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, December 19th. And I was just thinking the other day that the biggest problem, I think, for people that support the Ukraine war is that as time goes on, more and more people are forced to learn about the Ukraine war. And when they learn about the Ukraine war, they realize, wait, it didn't necessarily start on February 2022. And support is just going to continue to drop the longer it goes on because politicians won't stop talking about the Ukraine war. And then people are forced to look at this more closely, like, okay, what is this really about? And when they start to learn what it's really about, then they understand that the truth is not on the side of the Ukraine war advocates, and then they're in big trouble. So and the same thing with the Palestine conflict as well. I would say even more so. People realize, okay, the October 7th thing, oh my God, this was horrible. And then people say, as it drags on, people are like, okay, well, why did this happen? What's going on? And then the truth is just not on the side of the people that support Israel and that support Ukraine. And the longer it goes on, I just feel like that there's no way that they can win. The only chance that they could have succeeded is if it was a rapid victory, if they just did something very quickly before people had time to understand. Do you agree? You think that's maybe the biggest problem that these people have?
It certainly is a major challenge. I think, to be honest, within the West, within the collective West, they have largely met that challenge. Largely, not entirely. I think we're examples of where they failed. They have managed to to present this conflict as something that basically started, of course, on February 22nd, 2022, right? And that's not the case. But as you point out, I think you can see it especially outside of the West. Obviously within the West, but not within majority or mainstream opinion. But outside of the West, there has been a real shift. Initially, like within the UN, the votes condemning the invasion or the intervention or whatever you want to call it, the launch of the SMO in February 2022, were really very substantial. They're very large. They passed with very large majorities. But with every passing year, that shrinks, and you just find that I think throughout the rest of the world, people have come to understand. As they observe the conflict, as they've listened to the Russians, the Russian diplomatic corps, headed by Sergei Lavrov and Putin himself, have I think gone to great lengths to explain what's going on. They have listened to their friends and allies throughout the world. They have attempted to continue to pursue a diplomatic path. It's failed, and so anyway, they see that in much of the world, they see that this was not just. This was not unprovoked aggression. The Russians actually have a reasonable case, and that has gotten through over time. There's no question about it. But within the West, we're still, by and large, unfortunately, living in this fantasy land. And and it is important, if we're going to understand why this fantasy land is a fantasy, we need to look at the history. We have to understand that history did not begin again on February 22nd, 2022. There was a background to this. And if we have an understanding of that, then, the framing that the West uses for this conflict, it falls apart. So to a great extent, like you're saying, it's just sort of the framing, the arguments that the justification of support for Ukraine depends on ignorance, on a lack of historical knowledge. And the best way to address that is to have some kind of historical knowledge. And I think we can try to do that right now in brief fashion. We're not going to tell the whole history of Ukraine going back to there wasn't a Ukraine then, but of the region going back to the ninth century, as Putin did.
Right. I was about to say, just like Putin did, right? 3,000 years ago, we said it's like, okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people, they get just bits and pieces of the history through social media, and that's slowly opening people's eyes. They're like, whoa, I didn't hear about this event. I saw some clip here from 2014. I heard the Victoria Nuland recording, stuff like this. And so they have kind of a loose kind of understanding that there's more to the story. So maybe you can help, just maybe start us off. Where would you want to start with the history, that is most important for people to just kind of put everything in perspective?
Right. I was thinking about this. I would, looking at the Western framing, I identify, just thinking this over, it's kind of three aspects to Western support for Ukraine and demonization of Russia. Those two things go together. I would say the first is this notion of an unprovoked attack with the aim of just simply seizing territory. I think that's like the number one argument that's put out there, and it's this thinking that underlies so many of the statements we hear from our politicians. That's the first part of it. Okay, I think that's, again, of the Western understanding. I say a false understanding. An unprovoked attack to seize territory. In other words, sort of a neo-Soviet, and a neo-imperialist move on the part of Russia. The second is the framing of democracy versus authoritarianism. And you hear that again and again and again. We have to defend this plucky little democracy against the evil authoritarians in the East. And that's just constant. It's just a given, okay? And that's a big part of it, too. The third one, it doesn't generally show up directly, but I do hear it, and it's often implicit in a lot of the things that are said. And that is about some sort of ethnic hatred, actually, on the part of the Russians. Like, they hate Ukrainians. And again, I think that's a lesser factor, but it's there, and it is brought up kind of often implicitly. I'll give one example, is this notion that the Russians have abducted, according to the Ukrainians, 19,500 children, and they're brainwashing them somewhere. And then, and the idea, again, is just like, we have to protect these territories because if the Russians take them, they're going to persecute Ukrainians or what. That comes up. I don't know how much that is actually believed among the elite, but it does color the thinking of a lot of people. So I think we have to address those three aspects. And I could begin, again, with the unprovoked attack to seize territory. When it happened, when the SMO was launched in 2022, because people were so ignorant, it just seemed to come out of the blue. But of course it didn't. And if you were actually paying attention, you would know that the Russians were giving many warnings, and the Russians were deeply concerned, above all, by the eastward expansion of NATO. And this goes, all the way back. We can go, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but we go back to the agreements that were made there were verbal agreements made between Gorbachev and Western leaders, particularly the Americans, but also the Germans and other leaders of major Western, European countries. And that is that, okay, because remember at the time, 1989, before the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union controlled, all of Eastern Europe. Those were called the Warsaw Pact countries. They were really under a Soviet domination. There's no question about it. And it was also true of Eastern Germany. And anyway, at that time, there were already, the preparations were being made to withdraw. And Gorbachev agreed to do that peacefully, actually, to move out of all these territories. And he said, but with the understanding is that you don't expand into these territories. NATO, if it continues, needs to stay where it is. Because we would consider that a threat.
I've heard this story so many times that, the statement, not 1 inch to the east, for NATO expansion. But then you just said here that, there was a verbal agreement. And I've heard that as well. Like, I'm always kind of strange. Like, how could there not have been a more secure agreement? I mean, was it just a verbal agreement, or was there something more? I mean, there's a verbal agreement.
Right. Written records were taken, and they exist on both sides, and we can get into that very briefly. But that, and then the argument has been made on the Western side. Well, it was just, we never wrote it down. We didn't sign a treaty. Okay, well, and then later, okay, we did write some things down, but we didn't sign a treaty. But there was actually, so much of agreements made between nations are done that way. If you look back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, there wasn't a treaty; it was an agreement just made over the phone between Khrushchev and JFK, and that just took us back from the brink right there. Again, yeah, you pull your missiles out of Cuba, we'll pull our missiles out of Turkey. The second part wasn't actually revealed until much later, but that was the agreement. And they kept, it was just to say that we are serious people and our word matters. I mean, it's that way between individuals, on an important deal. And it's often that way between nations. It doesn't mean, okay, well, or you can say, well, yeah, you didn't write it down, so haha. Well, what kind of country are you? Again, in such a serious matter, and the consequences. You could have a treaty too. It shows, when it comes down to it, is about honor and it's about trust. And it, in a way, it doesn't really even matter unless you're talking about things that are very technical and detailed. Then you need to write it down because there can obviously be misunderstandings. But this was very simple. We could write it down, but then they could tear it up, right?
Yeah, but it helps, right? Because you go from one administration to the next, you make a deal, but then 4 years later, that guy's not in power anymore. And then, that deal was between that person, more so. Or
well, I mean, the same thing, unfortunately, can happen with treaties. Let's just be honest.
I know, but I think it
could help. And people within Russia have criticized Gorbachev for not doing that, for being too trusting. But I don't think, he really shouldn't even make that much of it because, again, this was clearly a matter of great importance. It was agreed solemnly between these people, the leaders of these countries, and everybody knew it on both sides. And it wasn't like the next administration didn't know it. They knew it, and they decided to ignore it. And they expanded. And it wasn't just Putin, but it was Yeltsin during the 1990s who began to protest louder and louder, say, hey, this is, as the moves it became clear that they were going to expand. And the first expansions occurred towards the end of the 1990s. Yeltsin was saying, this really disturbs us. It's not just me. It's the whole Russian political class is very upset about this and considers this to be a real threat. And of course, when Putin took power, he continued to say that and make it very, very clear. And it's not just that the Russians were saying this, but a lot of American experts, more than experts, but, statesmen, people like George Kennan, who, if you want to point to one statesman, like the most respected diplomat of the second half of the 20th century, you would point to George Kennan, who is described as the architect of the Cold War. Now, it's interesting, he was the architect of the Cold War, but he always had an understanding of Russia. He didn't hate the Russian people, and when the Soviet Union fell and he saw these moves towards the expansion of NATO, he started ringing the alarm bells really loudly and said very clearly that, this would be a mistake of historic proportions. This could lead to war. And if it finally does lead to war, this is what he said. I predict this is going to happen. When the Russians finally respond militarily to this, which they see as a threat to their very existence, the people who are advocating this expansion on our side are going to say, see, the Russians are monsters. And it's exactly, of course, what happened. But, he's just one. There's like William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, many people, diplomats, people in defense departments, and then academics. They, sent letters to the New York Times, these public statements signed by 20, 50, 100 academics and other experts and diplomats, saying that this is really serious. The Russians, this could lead to serious conflict. This is going to be, this is, again, a mistake of historic proportions. And then we even had there was that secret cable from Burns, who at that time was the ambassador to Moscow in the early 2000s, saying "niet" means "niet." It's just like the Russians are really adamant. They're really serious about Ukraine. He was talking about in particular. This is the reddest of red lines for them. And, please understand this. Now, later he became actually the head of the CIA, under Biden. But it was there. They knew it, but they just decided to ignore it, that this was the matter. So this talk of unprovoked, first of all, and then this is just about territorial aggression. There was clearly a concern about their own security. And if we can just briefly stop and think about Russia's history, you understand why. Russia has been subject to periodic invasions from the West. The best known, but they're certainly not the only ones, is the Napoleonic invasion. And then of course, Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion under Hitler, which were just enormously destructive and just in a way that we can't even conceive of. And they went through Ukraine, again. So it was just like, this is the matter. This is when Putin looks and the Russians look at it. You may think that they're rational or being silly, but they really believe it. And you can say, understand when their history, again, the most reliable estimates are that 27 million, citizens of the Soviet Union died during World War II, this Operation Barbarossa. That is so much more than what we suffered. World War II is very important to us. We honor our dead as we should, and so on and so forth. But it is just take that and multiply it, by 50 or more, and that's what it is for the Russians. And so it's clear that security concern was real. It's clear that we decided to ignore it. It's clear that the Russians continue to warn us. And they warned us, and the warnings got louder and louder as time went on. Right up to the invasion. There was the Russians were saying we need to renegotiate. We need to establish a security architecture for all of Europe. You need to take our own security interests into account, and the Americans refused to do it. So that's, first of all, there are other things that we can go into. Well, I guess the second part, maybe I'll talk about 2014.
Before you
right.
drive in there, this drive to expand NATO, do you think this drive was more ideological or was it more monetary? Was it more just like, can we get money? Because every single time we get another country in NATO, that's printing another $50 billion for the MIC. And that was the real incentive for that? Was it just greed? Or
I think there's no question that that is a good part of it. That the various think tanks that are funded by arms manufacturers in the U.S. we're pushing hard for it. That's true. So that's something that we can't discount. That's part of it. And then it's just this hubris. We've talked about the unipolar moment, and this thinking that, okay, now we have a chance to actually rule the world, and part of that is that we get to ignore the security concerns of rivals. So I think it's both of those. They work together. There's no question about it.
I just feel like this. Every movies you watch when you're a kid, the guy that tries to rule the world is always the bad guy. It's like that shouldn't be your your drive.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't understand it. But I guess that
well, they obviously didn't think of themselves as it's like, we're the force for good. So why should anybody oppose us? We just want to bring goodness to the world. I mean, that's really sometimes they really almost use that language. Just to give you an example, I think it was, there was that, we don't have to go into the details of it. There's what's called the Budapest Memorandum, which was, again, saying we shouldn't really, there's no intervention in these territories. You have Ukraine and Belarus, by either the West or by Russia. And we've talked about how actually the West broken in Ukraine, but I just want to mention in the case of Belarus is that the U.S. very clearly intervened in these elections, and to support their own candidate, and to their NGOs were activated. Whatever, there was a color revolution attempted in Belarus, and it was pointed out to them, hey, this violates the Budapest Memorandum, and they say, well, oh no, it doesn't, because we're just supporting democracy. We're not actually intervening. This is not, on behalf of our own interests. So in a way, they imagine, because they are the force for good, the things they do are just for good. There's not for their own interest. And I think that thinking, it's a very vain kind of way of looking at the world, but that's part of the problem, is that they don't rather than we're just one, pole in a multipolar world, or we're one, we're one side in a conflict. No, we are the force for good. And so any opposition to us is axiomatically evil, and anything that we do is motivated by good. And I'd be honest, again, you actually sometimes said pretty much directly, but I think it really underlies a lot of the thinking there.
I wonder if they watch movies like Star Wars, these guys are like, that Emperor Palpatine, he makes a lot of sense. I understand, like it's just strange.
Well, again, there is this thinking, and it was made explicit. I remember seeing a cover of the of a neocon magazine, like at the end of the 90s, and there was the American flag and Pax Americana, and the argument was made, I think it was by Kagan in there very strongly. It's just that, we need to, this is a way to bring peace to the world, is that if we can rule the world, we can have a Pax Americana, meaning, there will no longer be these competing forces, and there will no longer be conflict, because there will be just this one good force dominating the world. And, that really is what a lot of them thought. And that was one reason why they just would not listen to Russia. When Russia kept on saying louder and louder and louder, hey, wait a second, this is really serious. We're very, very concerned about this. And they were getting reports like that, that Burns communique is like, yeah, this is the reddest of red lines for them. They're really serious. We just ignored it.
So then what next?
Okay, so that in a nutshell is an answer to the unprovoked territorial grab part of it. I think another thing you can point about territory is that actually, like in 2014 was followed by the separatist, the Donbass uprising that actually began in Slavyansk, which is going to be in the news soon because the Russians are approaching it. It's really where it all began. Now, there is a claim immediately the Russians are behind it. There's actually no evidence the Russians were involved at all during the initial a few months of it. It was, it was purely a local movement, and the motivations were not, shouldn't really confuse anybody. The pro-Western and ultra-nationalist forces seized power in February of 2014. And the very first thing they did, or, attempted to do, was to actually remove the language protections for Russian speakers. And it's just looking at that. And the guy that they threw out was somebody who was known, was popular, supported in general by the Donbass and the eastern and southern Ukraine. He won with their votes. He took all of those regions with a strong majority, and he was the one that was kicked out in this coup. And the first thing they do is they move to suppress the Russian language. Now that actually failed, I think, for that move, but the move was made. It was like the first act of the Congress, and it failed, I think, because the pressure from the Europeans at that time said, hey, this doesn't look good. But then later it did happen, actually, within just a few laters, and we've had a success of a series of further efforts and measures to suppress the Russian language. But anyway, just going back to 2014, as they saw this, they realized, hey, we're in trouble. We have a hostile, regime in charge, unconstitutional. They take it over in a coup, and they hate us. They want to, they knew what was going on. So they had this uprising, right? Now, the Russians started to provide help. I think there's no question about it, like 3-4 months after, but not in a major way. They just sent some advisors, provided some arms or individual soldiers, volunteers, that kind of thing. And the Russians immediately tried to negotiate. Well, first of all, the Donbass, when they saw where things were going, they actually requested that Russia would accept them as part of Russia, that they would be accepted into the Russian Federation. And the Russians refused. Putin said, no, we're not going to do that. You're part of Ukraine. Right. And so he did, he gave them enough military aid so that they could at least hold the line. But he was careful. He calibrated it because he didn't want them going further to the west. He wanted a deal with the Ukrainians. And that's what he attempted. That's what the Minsk Accords were all about.
What do you think would have happened if Putin accepted them into Russia back then? You know, if these people voted and said, what do you think that would have been a good move?
Yeah, well, a lot
Because
of people.
we ended up with a
Yeah,
war anyway.
yeah,
So
that's true, and it would have been much less destructive at that time because Ukraine really wasn't ready to fight the war. So a lot of people have said that that was a mistake, and Putin himself is kind of admitted to some extent that, yeah, okay, I was kind of a fool back then, to trust the West. He said that I was mistaken to trust them, that they would actually honor the Minsk Accords. So you can say, yeah, it would have spared Ukraine a great deal of destruction. The cities would still be standing. Now they're so many of them are just being flattened. It would have saved many, obviously hundreds of thousands of lives. I guess on the other hand, it's just that maybe at that time Russia would not have been ready for the sanctions that would have been imposed on them. When 2022 rolled around, they were ready. They had 8 years to prepare. Also, they would not have had, I think it would have been more difficult for them to gain the support of the rest of the world. I think that's another aspect of it. But the fact is, at a huge, okay, you have the support of the rest of the world. The economy is able to withstand the sanctions. Okay, that's nothing to sneeze at. But then all these, there's 1 million people dead and, cities flattened on the other side. So take your pick. It's bad either way.
I think the fact that the U.S. had all this time, NATO had all this time to pump arms and equip the Ukrainians, that now that this conflict has broken out when it did, and, Russia was prepared, that this is making it, just a battle between NATO and Russia. And this will destroy the Western unipolar moment. If Russia went in earlier before, then maybe it would have been easier for the West to withdraw, and then they could still keep up this illusion that we are still in the unipolar moment and whatnot. But the fact that it's happened the way it did, I think, is shattering the unipolar moment. Yeah. So I think that's the main consequence of it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So anyway, it's. I mentioned what happened there in following the coup in 2014 and the insurrection, and then, but then the Russian actions. It's clear that they were trying. Actually, it wasn't about seizing territory. They could have easily done it then, or they obviously could have, but they worked. And they spent the next 8 years trying to make the Minsk Accords happen. And then they found out that, they realized at some point that there obviously was no intention on the other side of making them happen. But even then, it was, they still weren't going to make these eastern provinces, the Donbass in particular, part of Russia. It was shortly after the SMO was launched in 2022 that those republics, Donetsk and Lugansk, they declared their independence, but they weren't actually accepted as part of Russia. So still, okay, the Russians were stopping short of actually acquiring this territory and immediately went into negotiations. Like the day after the SMO was launched, again, they began negotiations, and of course we had the Istanbul Agreement that was initialed, and it's at that stage again the Russians were still not laying claim to those territories. They were still looking for some sort of negotiated settlement that, and they almost had it. We don't need to, we've gone into that before. But all of this is again just part of it. But all of this goes to show that this notion that the Russians were just bent on a territorial expansion just wasn't true. And that it was always, and we really knew it, was about their security concerns. And those security concerns were well-founded, and we just chose to ignore them. So it was not unprovoked. It was not a territorial acquisition. So that's the first part. And then the second part is, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I want to go back a little bit when you were talking about the Pax Americana and the idea that, okay, we can basically rule the whole world and there would be peace. And I was just thinking, the ultra-nationalists, when they took power, the first thing they did, like you said, was to try to ban the Russian language, basically de-Russify Ukraine, right? For example, like in Odessa, it was founded by Catherine the Great in 1794. There's been a statue that was erected there, I don't know, forever. But in 2022, they tore part of this de-Russification. They tore down that statue. And it makes me think here in the West as well, we've been tearing down lots of our statues. Is this just part of the West in general to kind of rewrite a new history in an attempt to achieve Pax Americana? It's like, okay, well, the way we need to do it is we just kind of erase the history of these other places, but the problem is there wasn't anything really to replace it. Like, what, we're going to erect a statue of like you said, a paper clip or a toilet paper roll or whatever, some modern art, BS. Right. And so I think that's an issue. But do you think that was part of the idea, that this isn't fully organic, that there was this idea that we need to kind of erase histories in a way to rewrite history to create Pax Americana?
Right. Well, yeah. Well, again, there's always this pretense that things started. It all began on February 22nd, 2022, and we don't talk about the history. But there's also been a larger movement, a disturbing movement towards historical revisionism, which increasingly paints the Soviet Union as the main culprit for World War II. And, you find this especially in like the Baltic states, and the atrocities committed by the Germans are downplayed or ignored entirely. And then, of course, it takes extreme form within Ukraine, where the celebration of Bandera and his movement is official. It's part the old Russian statues go down, and Soviet statues, and up goes statues of to Stepan Bandera or to Roman Shukovich, or again the heroes of this clearly fascist and ethno-supremacist movement in the 30s and 40s and actually even beyond. So yeah, historical revisionism is a trend. It's one thing, just to give you an example, I believe it was in France, at the end of the World War II, a survey was done. It was found, by a large majority, the French people understood that the main contributor, or the largest role in the defeat of Nazi Germany was by the Soviet Union. It was the Soviets who defeated them above all, more so than the Western powers did. And there's no question about that. I mean, by a large margin, you don't have to go to some like dissident historians. Historians acknowledge that. That's just the truth.
83% of Germans died on the Eastern Front. Not on the Western Front. 83%. Right. So it was the Soviets that did the heavy lifting. I mean,
Yeah. So, and again, to understand their view of World War II and, what the sacrifices they made is very important. And that is being done. Over the years, that understanding has gradually receded within the West, so that now you have strong majorities in Western countries that think the opposite. You think it was, mainly the West, and that the Soviet Union played a minor role. Now, this is part of the problem. Yeah, I agree.
Do you think why Mertz seems to be so gung-ho on going to war with Russia? Is there something there? Like, it's just, I don't know. Like, historically, I don't know if they're bitter, like the Kursk battle with tanks. They've talked about that before. Like, the German tanks are back in Kursk. It's just the Germans just want Russia. I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he almost seems like a comic book villain to me.
Right.
Just like,
it's the spectacles, too.
I know. It makes me think of, this is, I guess, probably before the time of most of our viewers, but I remember Hogan's Heroes was sort of a comedy set in a POW camp in Germany, and the head of the camp was Colonel Klink, And so anyway, so when I look at this Mertz, I think of Colonel Klink, or some sort of comic book Nazi villain, It
makes me think of in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the guy that's face melts when they open the Ark, the German Nazi. That's what he reminds me of. He's got the same look, same vibe.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so there is revisionism. There's no question about it, and that is part of the problem. But anyway, if I could go on to the second aspect, which is the authoritarianism versus democracy. And I think we can see that, most clearly if we just look at the 2014 coup. Now, it was Yanukovych was the president at that time, and he had been duly elected. Actually, nobody has actually denied that. He was elected in a fair election. He's described as being pro-Russian, which is, again, it's just not really an accurate description. It's just that he, like much of the country, the majority of the country, and that's why he was elected, favored continuing to have good relations with Russia. For cultural reasons, for economic reasons, very powerful economic reasons. It just made sense. There are all kinds of economic links, and but also very personal links, with Russia. So he was elected, and then he was overthrown in this coup. Now there's a claim that somehow it wasn't so, but it clearly was. There were these protests that we know in large part were funded by the West. We have that, the recording of Victoria Nuland beforehand. It was released by the Russians, but she's talking to the ambassador to Ukraine and saying, okay, yeah, F the EU, we got to move ahead with this. We're going to, and our man is Yats, that he's the guy we're going to put in power. And sure enough, after he was the one that was put in power. It was like people have described it as one of the most open public coups in the history of the world.
But within Ukraine, when this happened, didn't the majority of Ukrainians understand? Like you said, it was an open coup. You could listen to that recording after the EU. So they were all aware that, hey, yeah, the U.S. State Department just overthrew our government and we're okay with it?
Yeah, well, it's certainly
people in the Eastern Ukraine weren't, obviously, but
well, they were Eastern. They were not okay with it, and they understood what it was and what it meant for them. And then I think in the there's a certain mythology. We'll get into this. There's a particular massacre that led to his overthrow. It was just a couple of days prior to the coup. There were a number of people, actually on both sides, as police, but also, many of the protesters were shot dead by snipers. And this was pinned in the West, on Yanukovych. And it was used as an excuse for, storming the presidential buildings and office. And so prior to that, Yanukovych, as he saw what was coming, he fled, basically. He actually headed east to Kharkov, and then when the coup took place, he continued to fled, and he fled to Russia. But it was this massacre, so-called, that was used as a justification. Now, prior to this massacre, an agreement had been made. We're talking about another agreement, again, between the Yanukovych government on one side, and on the other side, you had the Germans, the French, actually, and the Poles, were co-signers to this. Again, an agreement that, there's this great discontent in this country, and to address the concerns of the protesters, we're going to hold elections in the near future. And that there was more to it than that. But again, Yanukovych, he didn't really have any reason, or there was no reason why he had to accept this. I mean, he was a duly elected president of Ukraine, but he did agree to this. He agreed in essence to step down, but according to this agreement, in a constitutional way. Now, then this massacre occurred, and then we had the storming, of the buildings, and we had the coup. Now, who carried out this massacre? If you look at it, I'll just point to two very powerful pieces of evidence. One was actually a study done by Professor Ivan Kachanovsky of the University of Ottawa. Very, very detailed, very thorough. You can find it on the internet. That he spent a lot of time, because look, everybody's got cell phones. So there's all kinds of video out there, and he spent a lot of time analyzing it, and he was able to identify like where the shots were taken from, and they were all coming from a certain building that was known to be occupied by the ultra-nationalists, the Ukrainian ultra-nationalists, headed by Parubi, who actually was not several months ago was assassinated. But a well-known ultra-nationalist, with roots going way back, even before the fall of the Soviet Union. He was always an ultra-nationalist, and he was also later involved in this terrible Odessa massacre. So those were his people. They had him. They even have there even footage of people coming out with violin cases, and we know that there weren't violins in there. That's where the sniping took place. Okay, well, that's one very powerful piece of evidence, and people can go and look at that study. Again, I'll mention that actually this professor is Ukrainian. He's not some sort of Putin apologist by any means at all. And then second, there was another phone call that was probably recorded by the Russians and later released, but it was between Lady Catherine Ashton, who was the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, who filled the same office that Kaja Kallas now does, for the EU. And she was talking to a foreign minister of one of the Baltic states. And the foreign minister was saying, actually, we're learning about this massacres, and it, everything is pointing to our guys. And she said, "Oh, really?" And so, they knew about it too. I mean, within, so in the end, okay. So again, so he fled. Yanukovych did, and I think for good reasons. Again, these people like Parubi are not nice people, very violent, and they probably a very good chance they would have killed him if he had stayed, and he knew that. Now, but what about the agreement that had been made, between the Ukrainians and the Russians, or Yanukovych and the Russians on one side and the West on the other? And say, okay, well, hey, wait a second. And that's one thing. It's like the Russians contact and say, Yanukovych just fled here, but you can go back. Remember, we had this agreement. We all worked this out. And then now everybody forgot about the agreement. Even Obama had, back then had said, okay, yeah, we support this. But the instant they got power, they forgot about it. When things went their way, then they forgot about it. This was a way to get rid of Yanukovych. Well, Yanukovych ran on his own, so we forget about the agreement. This was clearly so. What I'm doing here is just pointing out that this whole coup that really was the root of, if you want to point to one incident, one event that led to the launch of the SMO, it was anti-democratic at its core. Again, they were attempting to overthrow a duly elected president because they didn't like his policies, because he was delaying integration with the EU, and that he was maintaining relations with Russia. So again, this was, these protests were overwhelmingly supported by people in the western part of Ukraine and not the eastern part. And that's why, again, we later had a secession. So this was, and then there was an agreement to find some sort of constitutional solution, and then that was torn up. And then there was a massacre too. This was not a democratic revolution. It was anti-democratic, if anything. And then we can go on. It's just immediately, after these, it was Yats and then later Poroshenko that took power, and then Zelensky, and just since after following the coup, there has just been an increasing centralization of power, suppression of dissent, outright banning of, all real opposition parties. Now we have a few, but they're all basically, Maidan parties, people that supported the coup and are very close to Zelensky or whatever. But anyone that had any real, meaningful opposition, some of them leftist parties like communist parties, but also ones that wanted to maintain good relations with Russia. One after another party was actually banned. Again, television studios or broadcasting companies that were not following the government line, they were banned one after another. And again, there are moves to suppress the Russian language. This has just been ongoing ever since 2014. And now, of course, we have Zelensky, who is unelected. he has declared martial law and he's been in charge for all this time. And yet we still get this rhetoric from the West that this is about, we're defending the plucky Democrats, democracy against authoritarianism.
But that argument doesn't hold much weight now, right? Do you think when they make that case, do you think it really resonates with the people within Europe, especially when they see that their own democracies are crumbling, when people in the UK are being arrested for saying, free Palestine and things like this, or Palestine action,
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, I think it's just the whole concept of democracy has been corrupted. Maybe in the minds of these leaders, again, use this language again and again. This is a main part of their framing again of the whole conflict, right? It's democracy against authoritarianism. Again, I don't see press gangs in Russia, but you see them in Ukraine. Of course, this is not the story that's told to the Europeans and to the Americans. If you want to go find, it's easy enough to find the video footage of, for example, the press gangs. This is not something that should be happening in democracy, but it doesn't appear, because they still insist on that framing. But yeah, do they believe it? Maybe they do, but they don't seem to really even understand what democracy is anymore. Democracy, it seems to be in their minds, is that basically you align yourself with the West, and geopolitically and in terms of other core Western values, whatever it might be, like. But yeah, anyway, you have to align yourself with the West. That's democracy. And it's just like if the people vote for the other guy, that's not democracy. And we've seen that. We can Georgia, right. Moldova, Romania, one after another. And you see it even within Western Europe in so many cases. Again, like, oh no, we can't have this party in power because if that party actually was though they're the most popular party, we have to keep them out for the sake of democracy. And we hear that kind of language in this country too. So I think that's part of the problem. It's like, okay, maybe they really believe that, this is democracy, but their notion of democracy is basically align yourself with the EU. And so that's why Zelensky is somehow a Democrat, though he's completely shut down all the opposition and is has his press gangs roaming the country and
many members of like the U.S. State Department that orchestrated this, that were pushing this, like, for example, Victoria Nuland or Anthony Blinken, these are Jewish people with ties family ties in Ukraine, Russia, Eastern Europe. Isn't it odd that they would be supporting a neo-Nazi, fascist elements in Ukraine? Like, isn't that what you should be fighting against? If you historically, if you cared about your history, if you're a Jew in Ukraine, and this is, it doesn't make sense, right? Why would they want to? I understand they don't like Russia, but why would you feed this group? Prior to the SMO, there were mainstream articles about the Nazi problem in Ukraine. And then why do all these Jews in the State Department say, we're backing them, these are our guys? Like, I thought this was what you're supposed to be against more than anything else.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. It's one thing is, I was recently reading about some of the atrocities carried out, by the Germans, the SS, shortly after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, when they took Ukraine. They didn't immediately take all of it, but they, first they took the western half of it. Well, that was even before the Operation Barbarossa, with the non-aggression pact between the Germans and the Soviet Union. They actually, the Soviet Union gained control over Western Ukraine. No. I'm kind of mixing up a bunch of things. It was. I'm sorry. It was Operation Barbarossa. Okay. Going back. The Soviets had control of Western Ukraine because of the non-aggression pact. But then Operation Barbarossa was launched. The Germans moved in, and they moved in actually with units. This had been coordinated ahead of time that were Banderite. Bandera's people, had formed these units that were part of this invading German army. And both the Bandera's units and the militia that was created, immediately after the Germans moved in and pushed the Soviet army out, the Red Army out, very quickly, these atrocities began. And they were, in the end, they were directed against Jews, Poles, and Russians. But the initial attacks were on Jews, and they were carried out with sadistic fervor by both the Banderites, those official units that were part of the German army, but even more so by the unofficial militia that had been organized ahead of time, and they were really savage. I mean, I was reading, it was really horrible, what they did to these innocent Jewish civilians. It was just really sadistic, and it happened out in the open. It was very barbaric, and then later it was followed with much, larger massacres. Some
what
of
did
the
they
worst,
do?
because, it's just beatings, humiliations of all kinds, stripping the women naked, out on the streets, and then beating them and insulting them, and then dragging them in, raping them, then killing them. That's just one example. And it just happened out in the open, or having old people, forcing them to do these, like, for example, crawl around on their hands and knees, and then killing them, out there in the streets,
Just dehumanization.
Oh yeah, no, it was really horrible. It's just horrible. Sometimes because we've seen so much of what goes on in Gaza, you almost start to just forget about, there Jews did suffer terribly at different times in their history. And this was one time, I think you can make the case that the worst atrocities, the most open savagery really did take place in Ukraine. And a lot of it was carried out by Ukrainians themselves, the Banderites in particular.
It terrifies me when I hear these histories of just how people can treat other people this way.
Right.
And it just happened over and over again throughout history, just like what you just explained here, but also like in the Japanese in China. I was reading about Unit 731, just operating on people while they're alive, freezing their limbs and shattering them with sledgehammers, like just horrible, horrible things. It's just like, ooh, it's so scary to think that that humans are capable of more than dehumanizing, not even treating them worse than animals, worse than just going out of your way to like torture and just having no empathy or understanding. That's terrifying. How humans are able to do that. It is terrifying. And it's happening again. It's happening again. Again. Here in the Ukraine war, it's happening in Palestine. It's just it's that. I hate that that's a part of human nature. It
is very disturbing, but it's something that we have to be aware of, that there is always this potential for, these horrors. It's something that exists in the human heart.
I can't believe it does. I just can't see that, that anybody could, but it happens. So we know it does.
It does. But anyway, going back to your question, so how do we have, these prominent Jewish individuals, ignoring this history and actually working with these Banderites? And I think it's analogous to what we've seen in the Middle East, as Israel working with Al Qaeda, and they just feel like they can use them. They know that they're not their friends, but I think at least on one level, at least that's part of it, they feel like they can use them, that these are, they are the muscle. They're the ones that, if it wasn't for Parubi and his snipers, maybe the coup in 2014 would never have taken place. And so they understand they're necessary as part of this, and they are obsessed with this geopolitical goal. Now, maybe they bet that when it's all over, they can cast these people aside. Perhaps that's the way some of them think. I think that's probably true. But then, as I've made before, I'll just make this argument again. There's this risk that you work together too long, you end up actually assimilating some of the thinking of the people that you're working with. And I think you do see this very disturbing kind of fusion of Banderite thinking and Western hegemonic thinking take place. Who knows where it'll go, but you certainly see there are liberal nationalists in Ukraine that are very powerful. They represent a very small part of the population, but they're overrepresented in the government and always have been. and they look to the Banderites as their heroes. And actually, maybe that's like that kind of. This is something that I think, again, that going back to in history, the 2022, I think that's something that we look at is that we need to look at the rise of the Banderites. Again, they've all been there. Maybe it's another day we can go all the way back to the 30s and follow it up. But let's just go back to 2014 right now. At that time, in previous elections, the ultra-nationalists would just get they might get 2 or 3% of the vote. So a lot of people pointed to that and said, okay, yeah, they do have this Nazi problem, but look, they only get 2 or 3% of the vote. So
still a lot of Nazis.
Yeah, right. But the thing is that you can be 2 or 3%, but if you are passionate, you are organized, and you are violent, you can have influence well beyond, that 2 or 3%. And that's what happened. They were the ones who made this coup possible. So they were rewarded. They, even though they were only 2 or 3% of the population, according to the previous elections, they got major posts within the government. And then more than that, they became part of the government. They were part of the ruling structure. So, they weren't just out there on the fringes, just there's that small Nazi problem out there. They were there at the center of power, and now they had a share in that power. But then when the insurrection broke out, initially, the militias that were formed in the Donbass and Lugansk had tremendous success against the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army wasn't nearly as well armed as it is now, or well trained. And also, a lot of those soldiers did not want to fire on what they considered to be their brothers. And so there was an unwillingness to fight. You say, I don't want to shoot. These are, that's my cousin over there. I'm not going to do this. So you had the Ukrainian government had a real problem, including these liberal nationalists that took power. And again, they realized we need the ultra-nationalists. So this is where you get the formation of Azov and so on and so forth. The formation of these ultra-nationalist Banderite military formations. And they did, the lion's share of the fighting. And to this day, so now they're not only represented in government, but they're also, they are the most powerful part of the military. Maybe not in numbers, but in influence. There's no question about it. And you can see, the polls all show that if an election was held today, the likely victor would be Zaluzhny. Again, a man who had not one, but 2 busts of Stepan Bandera in his office. He's a Banderite now. But the thing is, you find at the top, there's sort of this kind of the strange fusion, again, of the liberal nationalists and the ultra-nationalists. The liberal nationalists consider the ultra-nationalists to be their heroes, right? And then some of the ultra-nationalists, when they get in the government, they start to kind of pick up some of the talk of and maybe the thinking of the liberal nationalists. So you have this fusion that maybe it kind of drops the anti-Jewish stuff. I don't know, maybe that's temporary and just tactical, or that's really a significant evolution in Banderism. But what they keep, of course, is the hatred of Russia and the glorification of violence.
Okay, well, so we've covered you said there are 3 things. We've covered 2 of them. The last one you said was Russian hatred of Ukraine. Like
right.
That's the narrative that they're trying to push. But it's just so clear that it's the other way around, though, right?
Yeah, right. That's not right. Okay. So anyway, I just wanted to add, I bring up this about the Banderites to say that you're not supporting a democracy here. Not only has the Ukrainian government essentially, banned all opposition, all opposition voices at many different levels. And there's also this obvious cultural and, religious and linguistic oppression. This is, and it's under martial law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It also has this Banderite, fascist coloring. This framing is just totally false, that we're supporting democracy against authoritarianism. But let's go to the last one. And you don't hear that's made so explicit, but it's implicit. And I mentioned the example of the so-called abducted children. The Ukrainians have insisted they've had wildly inflated figures. I think now they're insisting that there are 19,500 abducted children. And then there was even this case that was brought to the ICC, and the arrest warrants issued for Putin.
Right.
So
that's
always
why
out
the
there.
arrest warrant for Putin was because of that.
Right.
Something that I think it was wasn't it Biden set up some department specifically to do this? Like I was looking into it a while ago. I forget how.
Yeah, I'm
worked,
sure I went. Yeah, that's probably true. I don't know all the details of that. But the thing is absurd. One thing like the Russians keep on saying is, okay, well, give us their names. And recently, of course, there were some meetings between the Russian negotiating team and the Ukrainian negotiating team in Istanbul, right, a few months ago. And the Russians were asking for the names. They say, okay, if you have these kids over here, we'll find them and get them back to you if they really are, if their parents really are over on your side. And instead of giving them a list of 19,500, they came up with something like 320. So it just shows right that the whole thing was a lie. And the Russians looked at it, and it turns out a lot of those so-called kids are adults. Others don't exist. They can't find any. And some of them are saying, yeah, okay, these are kids. Maybe there's one parent on the other side of the line, because this happens in war, or maybe both parents, like the kid was staying with an aunt or something, and the parents want him back and they're over on the other side. And so they work to get, we're talking about rather than thousands, we're talking about a couple dozen, a few dozen. This is just going to happen in a war. And, so that's, one thing, just to show that whole thing is just completely false. It's absurd. And, again, people talk about it like it's a fact, but nobody can ever show you anything. They can't put a face to it. They can't, because nothing happened. The Russians acted very humanely. When the war began, they worked to evacuate children, as they should. These places are being shelled and so on and so forth. And then and if their parents were on the other side, and it was, and they could find them, they did what they did to send them back.
How could the ICC issue an arrest warrant without real evidence? Doesn't that just destroy the credibility of that institution?
Yeah.
Because, the ICC...
I think it should have been destroyed long before. It's always been really an instrument of the establishment liberal West. That's what it is. They know the one kind of exception where they've gotten themselves into hot water is issuing the arrest warrant for Netanyahu.
Yeah, Netanyahu and Golan. Yeah. I was going to say that. Yeah, I mean, they've done that. So
right, that's I think the only time where they really took a risk to go against at least is a certain faction, let's say, within definitely the Trump administration is furious about this, but this happened under Biden, and Biden didn't mind it, because remember the Democratic Party, they're very Zionist, all in all. It's beginning to crumble a little bit at the edges, but all in all, the Democratic Party is a very strong supporter of Israel, of Zionist Israel. But they're not supporters of Netanyahu. Netanyahu has really tied his fate to the Republicans and to the Trump. So they wouldn't mind. Again, let's not forget it was Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York. It was early on in the war against Gaza where he said, this is Netanyahu's got to go. But it's like, because Netanyahu and his people, Ben Gvir, that's just an ugly face that a lot of American Jews and, American liberals were beginning to notice. They still are committed to Zionism, but we said, we got to get these people out. They're this is an ugly face. We got to get some pretty faces in there and slow things down. We get back to our slow motion ethnic cleansing, I've gone into all of this. But anyway, just going back to the ICC case, it's just that this was a case where there is a split within the liberal establishment. In general, the liberal establishment, again, actually doesn't like Netanyahu. So I think that's why it happened. It's not a case brought against Zionism. And if you get somebody in there that it kind of is a little bit, can talk the language of establishment liberals, everything will be okay. Even though the ethnic cleansing, the suffering will continue in these places, they're going to be happy with that. So anyway, let's just set that aside. We've talked about the ICC, and we've talked about this children's abduction. That's part of what it's this suggestion that the Russians have this ethnic hatred. Another thing that's brought up, actually, especially by the Ukrainians, is the Holodomor, the famine, the terrible, terrible, cruel famine, that took place in the 1930s, in the early 1930s in Ukraine under Stalin. And, roughly some 3 million, more than 3 million Ukrainians died. It was horrible. There was cannibalism and, just dead bodies lying on the road. And the suggestion has been made, there's again, I would say just a revisionist history, among Ukrainian historians, nationalist historians in Ukraine and their supporters in the West, that this was something directed against Ukrainians, that there was this kind of somehow an ethnic hatred of Ukraine. So now the thing is, first of all, look at it in per capita terms. It was the famine. It was a part of this collectivization drive, right? This is when it happened. The famine was actually worse in per capita terms in Kazakhstan. It wasn't, Ukraine was a much more populous province, so that the total numbers were higher there. But in general, you found it was something that happened in wheat-growing regions, and then in Kazakhstan, because the collectivization involved the what they call denomadization. They were nomads, and this was just carried out in an incompetent and cruel manner. They had a way of life, that supported them, and the agents of Stalin who are carrying out this collectivization just made no effort to really think through the consequences of a lot of their actions. No more, you can't do this. Now you're going to start building this collective farm over here. And the end result is that people starved. Then starved.
Collectivization, what does that mean exactly? You're saying, what is
it's an end to private property. This is part of the communist revolution. Is that, okay, there are these different farmers or peasants or whatever in Ukraine and other parts of Russia, because, many Russians also died, not as many as in Ukraine, but in other provinces, many died as well. They were moved, off from their farms, or, from herding their sheep or, whatever it was in Kazakhstan, onto these collective farms that were administered by the Soviet state. And so it was reading about this, I was reminded of actually the Great Leap Forward in China.
I was about to say that's what.
Yeah, that was actually the consequences. We don't know how many died, but clearly more people died in China, many more, because of this. And if you look at it, certain provinces suffered a lot more than others. For example, Sichuan province suffered the greatest number of fatalities because of this Great Leap Forward, which it wasn't a collectivization drive, but it was a decision by Mao to industrialize industrialize the countryside. So he ordered these little peasant villages. They had a way, a lot of them, again, they could survive, but just barely. They were able to grow. They were subsistence farmers, and they could just grow enough to feed themselves. And he said, well, now, we're going to industrialize. This is going to make us rich, and we're going to catch up with the Brits and the Americans. And so I want you to take your plows and melt them down so that we can make, whatever, some industrial good. And you build a forge there in your village. And it just didn't make any economic sense. But it wasn't something like they were trying to get the Sichuanese in particular. It's the same thing. It was just it was incompetent. It showed a real ignorance of economic realities. It was carried out in both an incompetent and a really cruel and rushed manner, and the consequences were horrific in both places. But there's no reason, there's just absolutely no evidence that somehow there was a special animus for Ukrainians or for Kazakhs, for that matter. It was, it was just a byproduct of this really poorly thought out scheme that was being carried out, again, just quickly without any effort to understand, local realities and work with them. And then you get a lot of evidence, for example, that, okay, Stalin, by the way, was not Russian. He's Georgian, right? So, he's the guy in charge of this, so he's not even a Russian himself. But he would get reports there were a lot of yes men out there say, "Hey, things are going great," and you'd hear that. But then there were some of his, people on the ground were more honest and saying, "This is not working. This is off. People are starving. We got to slow down. We can't, we can't take such a large share of the grain. They need it to survive." And he was getting those reports, and he was kind of upset about them, but he did actually again and again respond to them like, "Okay, cut back. We're not going to take so much of the grain, so we'll move our targets back a little bit." And then even imported some grain from the West to relieve the famine. Again, it was woefully inadequate, but there were measures taken to try to relieve the famine, and then even to start allocating resources that were going to certain cities and in Western Russia and sending them to Ukraine. Again, it was woefully inadequate, but there was obviously no plan to starve, like it was some sort of intentional genocide. You just don't find it, and it's just not there. But it's something that's brought up, and that is taught now in Ukrainian schools. The Russians deliberately starve us because they hate us Ukrainians, and it's nonsense. Again, Ukrainians and Russians are very closely linked. You go like in Western Russia, you scratch a Western Russian, you're likely to find a Ukrainian. There's some Ukrainian member of the family, and the same thing within Ukraine. The links to Russia are numerous and just almost universal. Throughout much of Ukraine, and again in Western Russia. These are not people. There's not this ethnic hatred. That's inside. The only ethnic hatred is really from the bandrites who are based in the West, and that is anti-Russian. And it used to be, back in the day, it was anti-Polish, anti-Jewish, anti-Russian, and the anti-Russian is stayed. But you just don't find it at all. Again, your sister was telling me that, like prior to the SMO, if there was a soccer game and the Ukrainians were playing, the Russians in the bar would always be cheering for the Ukrainians. But sometimes you get, again, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, this idea that there's some sort of ethnic hatred for Ukraine. Another thing I would point to again is that actually Ukraine, like during the Soviet years, was overrepresented at the highest levels of power. Khrushchev was Ukrainian, and that's why Crimea, he decided just to gift it to Ukraine. But then Brezhnev, during my youth, if I thought about the Soviet Union, I always thought of the image of Brezhnev, this heavy-set guy with the big eyebrows, and he was there in charge forever. It seemed like he was always the leader. He was Ukrainian too. He came from Dnipropetrovsk, and so many of his people in the ruling circle they were kind of called the Dnipropetrovsk Mafia, and they ran the Soviet Union, like through much of the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. But there was, Ukraine was, if there was this, in fact, some sort of ethnic hatred, it just, but that wouldn't happen. And there's just no evidence for it. And in fact, again, both in the Soviet Union and in Russia, there is an effort to preserve ethnic minorities. And Ukrainians that do live within the Russian Federation have a right, like language rights, which, the Russian cousins in Ukraine don't have. Again, it's very, very common. And then during the Soviet years, the Ukrainian language was actually privileged within Ukraine, even though, the majority of people were Russian speakers.
How do you know so much, Dad?
I'm trying hard to learn something.
Yeah, it's hard enough just for me to keep up.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was, I learned a lot. How are you feeling? Do you think I could ask another topic?
Okay. Yeah. Probably make it short, but let's do it.
Okay. Well, we'll see how it goes. But we had a comment about this on one of the videos, and I thought it was a good one because we were talking about just how Russia has no choice but to take the Black Sea coast, which means taking Odessa. And then someone said, "Yeah, okay. Well, how do you do that? How do you take Odessa?" And I was like, yeah, it's easy to say, just do it, but it's a big city. It's on the coast. I'm sure it's heavily fortified. I mean, how do you take a city like Odessa?
No, it's a very good question, and with great difficulty. That's true. Well, first of all, I have to say the other day you were right. I was wrong. The third largest city in Ukraine is Odessa. It has a population, or had a population, it may still have one, of about 1 million. I said Dnipropetrovsk, that has a population of about 970,000. So it's close. But Odessa is third. Dnipropetrovsk is fourth. So first of all, it is a big city, and that's something, to keep in mind. That's not going to be easy to take the city itself. But more than that, to get there, let's say starting at Kherson region, that's the closest. You would have to cross, 5 bodies of water. You had the first, the Dnieper, but then there are these other rivers that are dammed and are essentially lakes, and in some cases estuaries, like Nikolaev. You'd have to go past Nikolaev, and there's a river that flows through it and down, into the Black Sea, called the Southern Bug. That's the English translation. But it is essentially an estuary and quite wide towards the coast and all the way up to Nikolaev. And Nikolaev itself is a major city, approximately, 475,000. But you have 5 of these. These are major bodies of water. They're essentially dammed rivers, lakes, estuaries along the coast. And in fact, I think they're so wide in places it just wouldn't be possible for the Russians to cross them close to the coast. I measured a distance of roughly from Kherson city, or, just on the other side of Kherson city in Russian-held territory, to Odessa, of about 90 miles. But that's a straight line, and there's no way you could do that. You would have to actually go up, and then to the north, and then come back down. So it wouldn't be 90 miles. It would be at least 150 miles or something. And that would be, there would be water that would have to be crossed. Nikolaev, a major city, that would have to be taken. And then you would have your left flank exposed, because there's going to be all this territory to the south of you. And this is something the Russians haven't done. Just also to put it in perspective, 90 miles is about the distance between Ugledar and Zaporozhye. And I think just the last time, or maybe it was a couple episodes ago, was saying that the Russians had, in the last year or so, had gone roughly half that distance from, so they were like halfway to Zaporozhye. So in other words, 90 miles, and this is where they're moving faster. It would be about 2 years. But we're talking about this 90 miles, it's impossible. Again, it would have to go up and over. So yeah, no, it's a huge challenge. I think even during World War II, when the Russians were pushing back the Germans, they didn't attempt to make any, a marine landing or to actually attack Odessa from the coast. They went way up north, actually, to Kiev, and then came down. That was the way they do it. And I think the Russians would have to do something like that. Maybe they don't have to go as far as north as Kiev, but they could go from, let's say, Dnipropetrovsk or Zaporozhye, and move west and then south from there. But there are difficulties again with that. I mean, it's just like the Russian practice so far at this stage of the war has been is not to break through into the rear of the enemy, but to actually move the sections of the front together. It's like the whole front is moving. Now, so I would say, yeah, this viewer's question is very right. This is going to be a very difficult task. And that's why I was saying, a lot of people were saying, well, we're close to the end of the war. But you look at it, no, they got a lot to go. Now, I think they're dependent. They wouldn't even try to do this now, but they are expecting that at some point we really will see a collapse. And I think that's the only time they can do it. And maybe when there's really a collapse, again, I don't think they'll go from the coast. They'll probably go somewhere to the north and then back down south. But it may be that they'll be able to do it at that time and then do it in a really relatively rapid fashion. But we're not there yet. Maybe we're getting close. Maybe there will be a collapse in the near future. I'm not going to make any predictions. But you're going to have an obvious collapse in just the ability of the Ukrainian armed forces to resist. They still can put up a fair amount of resistance, even in places like Zaporozhye, where the Russians are moving faster than they have been before. But they're going to have to be attrited a lot more, the Ukrainians a lot more than they have been so far, before a move can be made on Odessa. No question about it.
Why can't they do anything via the sea? With their navy. I mean, Crimea. I mean, the whole point of Russia needing to secure Crimea was that was their only warm water port that they needed. That's the largest naval base, Russia's largest naval base, right there. But we haven't really seen anything really with the Russian Navy, so to speak. Just there hasn't really been any naval battles. Is it that in this day and age, navies just are kind of obsolete? They're too vulnerable to drones and missiles?
Yeah. I think there's some truth to that. And there's also the fact that the Ukrainian Navy is gone. I think, well, first of all, I believe it was in 2014 that 75% of the Ukrainian Navy in Crimea just defected to the Russians. And then later, after the SMO was launched in 2022, the Russians destroyed what remained of the Ukrainian Navy. So we're not going to see any naval battles because there isn't another side.
Well, if they have no Navy, then go on in with your Navy, right?
But the problem is, as you're pointing out, I think that kind of like tanks in this day and age, naval vessels are vulnerable to cheap drones. And that has really changed the whole calculus. It has made them they're just very vulnerable. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that the Russians just don't have a significant Marine Corps. They don't have this amphibious capability. That's something that the Americans do have. We have a lot of amphibious ships. And, actually some of them are off the coast of Venezuela right now. But the Russians don't have it. So I think there's just even when you have that capability, amphibious landings are very difficult, very costly, as we could see like a D-Day and so much of the island hopping in the Pacific Ocean against Japan. Those are very, very costly battles. But it's just out of the question for the Russians. I don't think they have that capability. And especially these days with the sea drones, it would be, I think, very risky and probably catastrophic if the Russians attempt to do that. I think they have to go by land.
Okay, so we were then expecting the move will just be one, there is a frontline collapse, there's a rout, and then there will be very little resistance, and then you think they could just more or less just march on in with very little. Yeah. That's the only way that it can be done.
I think that's right, and they would probably even then come in from the north or the northeast.
The thing is, when a rout happens, collapse happens, I think the hard part for the Russians will be stopping. I think that they'll be like, look, we want it. We just got to go all the way. I think there'll be a lot of momentum. I mean, just imagine how we would behave if there was a collapse. We're like, we're going all the way to Moscow. Let's do it. That's what we would do. So it's like, will the Russians, we say like they have to secure the Black Sea coast. We understand that, maybe Kharkov, the Dnieper patrols, but don't you think that a problem that Russia will have is that once you have the war machine going, the war has gone on so long, people aren't here. It's like, we're not going to stop. We won. Now we got to take it. It's like, we can't stop now. What was all this for? And so if this collapse happens, there could be just a massive push. Like, I think that's a whole nother problem that we'll have is how does Russia stop the war machine, stop the advance, because there will be that momentum to keep moving.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a danger. I hope that common sense will prevail, and I think it's reasonable to have that hope with Putin at the helm. He's shown himself to be very rational. He doesn't ride tides of emotion, and I think he probably understands that you go too far, then you enter into truly hostile territory. The Russians describe the captures of these different villages and towns and cities as liberations. And I think that's actually a fair characterization because we are talking about people who want to be part of Russia, the great majority of the people in the regions where they are now. And that'll be true, if they go to Odessa too. But they go too far beyond Odessa, then they enter into increasingly hostile territory. I think they'll be reluctant to do that. But but you're right. No, that could happen.
But just the fact that it's hostile territory just means that you haven't won in that sense. So that's why you got to root out anything that's
right. Yeah, no,
that would be the argument.
Again, that's true, and people do make that argument. Very well informed, smart people like Mark Sloboda says that they don't want to do it, but they're going to have to do it.
Right. When there's a collapse, then you think like, okay, as long as there's still hostile elements, then this is the opportune time to root out all those hostile elements, which means going all the way to the border, or potentially, of Poland and Romania, which will be terrifying if that happens.
Yeah,
Because
right.
if you don't,
Right.
but if you don't, then we know what the Europeans are going to do, or what they'll try to do, is just to continue to arm what's the ultra-nationalist, the band of right faction, just to keep it going. Maybe Mark Sloat is right. Maybe they when this happens, they might just. I don't know. We'll just have to see. I don't want to speculate.
Yeah,
But,
right. I don't think they're going to go all the way to the Polish border. I think that they're going to keep out of Western Ukraine, but I may be wrong. And, for the reasons that you gave and that Mark Sloboda has given.
I think that I have a feeling that they will go to Kiev when this. That's just my personal feeling, just because we've talked a little bit about the history. You said that actually Kiev is sort of the historical capital even of Russia.
Right,
It's always been kind of back and forth, between the West and the East, but it does have very strong ties. And I have a feeling like also if you just want to end this war, you have to take the command center, which is Kiev. That is where it is. So it's like that would maybe give a note of finality to it. It's like, look, it's over. Russia now has Kiev,
Right.
To just, do you want him to go to Lvov? It's like.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it's certainly more likely. I don't know if they're going to do that, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point the decision is taken to take Kiev. I would be surprised if they try to go all the way to Lviv,
Yeah. Yeah, I would too. But I'm just thinking, this collapse, we've been talking about it. People would just say, like you said, 90 miles the distance between what Odessa and
Kherson. It's essentially right across the river from Kherson City.
Right, and in 1 year, you said they only moved half that distance, 45 miles down in the south in Zaporozhye, where they're moving more rapidly.
Yeah.
But so we look at it that way, but we have to understand that when there is a collapse, the whole thing just changes. It just then all of a sudden going to Kiev is very reasonable.
Right. Yeah. Again, I think it's very similar to World War I, that the battle lines were very static for about 3 years. They hardly moved at all. And if you were just looking at the map, you'd say, well, obviously, the Allies are not getting anywhere. This is obviously a total failure. But they were, they were treating the Germans, and finally, the balance tipped in favor of the Western forces, and it ended really pretty quickly after that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's end it there, Dan. It was a long one today.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
Okay,
Thank you very
too.
much. All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.